Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Addis Dialogue. My guest today is John Philpot. He's an international lawyer. He's joining me from Canada. We're going to talk about things unfolding in Ethiopia, so do stay with us. John Philpot, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It's an honor for me to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. So let's just jump right into the question. My first question would be, I'm sure you have followed this because you are following new developments unfolding in Ethiopia. So criminal investigation reports in Ethiopia disclosed that the terrorist TPLF has killed thousands of civilians in Amhara and Afar regions extrajudicially. And the finding also showed extensive and systematic looting of public and private properties, and also sacred items of religious institutions in both regions, that is in Amhara region and in Afar region. So as an international lawyer, tell me please, what is the crime unfolding here from the legal perspective?
Right. Well, let's remember now, your country is sovereign and you have a very developed criminal code adopted in 2004, ironically by the previous government, but that doesn't matter. They adopted it, and the criminal code is a modern criminal code. And your country has the right and the duty to investigate crimes committed in Ethiopia. So your courts and your prosecution service and your government can investigate these crimes. And these crimes include, and I have not, looting, which is Article 273 of your criminal code, murder, property damage 662, and there are other dispositions in your criminal code dealing with sacred items and in your country. So your country has the right and the duty to the people to investigate and charge for these crimes. There are additional provisions in your criminal code to deal with the TPLF, which I think we'll get to through this interview.
Thank you for that explanation. So as such, the terrorist TPLF has violated both national criminal law and international law to which Ethiopia is a party or applies dictates of customary international law. This is what many say. So the investigation also indicates war crimes and crimes against humanity by the TPLF. As an international lawyer, what is your say here?
Well, your criminal code, again, has a disposition for armed rebellion, Article 240. And in Articles 269 to 274, your country can charge people in its own courts for war crimes. It's your national jurisdiction which should apply. I'm going to make a small aside about the International Criminal Court, which does not bind your country. Your country never ratified the Rome Statute. And I'll jokingly say, thank God, but we can talk about that. The International Criminal Court for another country, forget your country now, can only intervene if your national courts cannot deal with if the national courts cannot deal with it. I think your national courts can deal with it. So if you were with the ICC, it still would not be prosecuted, in my opinion, by the International Criminal Court in The Hague, which is often called the International Colonial Court. All right. Now that's an explanation, it's an explanation from an international lawyer. And this would apply to, let's say, Libya or Morocco, I'm jokingly, or the US. Okay. Well, the US is not bound by it. But anyway, so your criminal code, once again, it's quite easy to read it. You can download it. and read it and understand it. And it's a very manageable document. And so this again comes back to the original point, which is that your sovereign government has the right to, and again, the duty to its people to apply the law. And the question of armed rebellion is very important because from the 3rd of November 2020, there was an armed rebellion, which is illegal in your country, and the authors of such an armed rebellion can be charged.
Against the backdrop of this, sir, we see the International Commission of Human Rights Experts, accusations and allegations, which has angered Ethiopians. I'm curious here, how do you see the report? And if so, what are some of your observations, especially in terms of its sexuality bias?
Well, yeah, this is a very interesting historical institution, which is bad, I think, for your country. There's many ways of looking at the problems. First, its formation. When it was formed on December 17th, 2021, am I right about the date? I think the date's right. It was voted on in the Human Rights Committee, and the vote was 21 for, 15 against, 11 abstentions. So 21 for, and the abstentions and against were 26. So it's not, doesn't seem to have a support in the broad international community. China, Russia, Cuba, Eritrea voted against. No white country, because we're talking about colonialism, voted against it. No African country voted for the creation of this commission. So its foundation is, in my opinion, not valid, but rather dubious to say the least. All right. The second aspect of related to this is the two bills in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives 6600 and Senate 3199, which is the US gives itself the right in the law to judge human rights in your country. By what right could the US look at human rights, particularly with what the US does to Black people and the US does to its poor and the homeless who are Black and white in every color? They have no right to judge your country, and they call for the creation of human rights investigations. And this overlaps with this Human Rights Commission. It's one of the underlying ideological aspects of it, and they want to look at human rights. And one thing that comes back again and again is the freedom of movement and the freedom of humanitarian aid. And this is a theme which comes up also in this human rights report. And you are in your country, and your people know what's going wrong. I have read that there is a problem of food distribution in the north, which is used to transport arms. The investigations in your country will tell whether I'm right or not. But this is what I have read. So once again, the idea of freedom of movement. When a country's at war, you have to have checkpoints everywhere. If we had a war in Canada, which we don't now, there would be checkpoints everywhere. We had checkpoints during COVID to move from region to region. Yeah. So that's a second important aspect of this commission. And these are items which should be discussed because they can be used in other countries. And because there's going to be other crises. Right now, those are very big crises in the Horn of Africa. The third aspect, one third aspect of this commission, of this human rights investigation, is the membership. Originally, it was Fatou Bensouda who was prosecutor. She was taken off, a prosecutor of the ICC, which always persecuted Africans. She was taken off it, but there's now three people. Stephen Ratner, who's a professor, a law professor in the US, consultant to the State Department, and we go back to these bills which talk about making reports to the State Department. And since when does an American professor consultant to the State Department have a right to investigate human rights in your country? The second person is a Madame Betty Murungi. She's Kenyan. Now, I've been involved in East Africa for some 20 years. And I'm not an expert, but I was at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. I was at the International Criminal Court with the charges against Kenya, which were not founded. And I look at the CV of Betty Murungi. She worked in Rwanda from 2007 or 2008. I don't have the date in front of me. And you've got to remember that Rwanda was taken over by a proxy army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. People sometimes don't look back at that history. It was a proxy army like the TPLF. Things are different. Every country's different. Your country has 115 million people. Rwanda had 8 million, but it was still a proxy army which took power by force. And then we had what's called the Rwandan genocide. I don't like the term because a lot of people died. It was a horrible situation, but the losers in the war and the winners all suffered terribly, and different ethnic groups, Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa, died on a large scale. And I don't, but anyway, she was working in a regime controlled by a minority, the Tutsi minority of Paul Kagame, who's close to the TPLF, by the way. People don't realize that. Maybe they don't realize it. So she is now influenced by this idea. And in the human rights, in quotation marks, industry, there's a huge number of people who make money out of the UN and supporting the Rwandan and intervention in Africa in general. So I wouldn't trust her. The third person I don't know much about, so I won't comment on her. It would be inappropriate for me to comment on somebody I can't fully understand. On September 7th, this Human Rights Commission made a public intervention deploring the war which had started up in your country. Since when has the Human Rights Commission got a public political role to play? Many people would say the war that you're having in your country, although regrettable, is necessary to put down the uprising. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but it's not their job to intervene in this. So this Human Rights Committee, and then if you look at their report, right in the early part of the report, they describe what happened in November 2020. And they said in the northern region, some soldiers started fighting each other. That's a mischaracterization of what happened. It's a rebellion, an armed rebellion against a government which was properly constituted. And any lawyer who has honesty, and these are lawyers, right? I think they're all lawyers, has to tell the truth. So that coloring of their report by characterizing the conflict in 3rd of November, I think it was the night of the 3rd to the 4th, 2020, is dishonest, and it covers it. If you start with a document and the foundation is wrong, it's very worrisome for the rest of the report. Now, they made, from what I can see, I'm just seeing whether your questions will deal with. Yeah, well, it's quite biased because they do not seem to have addressed the issues of crimes committed by the TPLF. And they seem only to talk about alleged crimes committed by the government soldiers and government army. This is a big issue, and we've seen this in the past when international commissions have dealt with problems in kind of that part of Africa, a bit south, but they had problems in Rwanda where a commission in 1993 only looked at the government side and not at the rebel side. And they had a big problem in Burundi when Burundi was they were trying to have a RPF style uprising in Burundi, which didn't succeed. And maybe I'll get back and talk about the use of sovereignty to resolve these problems in a minute or two. So these are some of the biases of this commission. And I know your government had the wisdom to not let them go outside Addis Ababa, if I'm not mistaken. And I wonder if they should even let them back into the country. I don't know. That's a decision of your government, but I certainly would not trust them.
Thank you so much for that wonderful piece of information. Also, the analogy that you made, sir. Moving on from that, the report is also said to have blatantly failed to publicly rebuke TPLF, which has been using children as soldiers or fathers of cannon. So let me also ask you this question. What's the kind of conscripting children as soldiers?
Well, it's not only a crime, it's an issue which is raised in the United Nations. And I'm older than you are, but in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of discussion of child soldiers in the north of Uganda. There's been a lot of wars, and children have been conscripted. So the UN General Assembly in 2000 adopted the optional protocol on the Convention of the Rights of the Child and the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict. And this requires members of the United Nations to not recruit children under 18, not conscript children under the soldiers from under the age of 18, to take positive measures not to do it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these are extremely important provisions. And here we have the human rights from Geneva forgetting about it. And so they're not looking at things. The West, and I consider this as a symbol of the West, or Europe. They believe in human rights when it's convenient for them, but when the world gets together and adopts some principles of defending children, they forget about them. And this protocol entered in force in 2002 and has been ratified by a majority of the countries. So we see a double standard by this Human Rights Committee because it's not convenient for them. There's something I'd like to mention, which from my own research, and we've heard the discussion of the negotiations and whether the African Union should be the mediator in the war, or whether they should have the US and Kenya, et cetera, as mediator. And I was at the conference of the African Bar Association in Malawi in August. Next year, it's going to be in South Africa. I would recommend Ethiopia be present. But I presented a paper comparing who are the best mediators. And I recommended in this paper, not that I'm that important, but I studied this, that the African Union play the primary role. And the TPLF wanted Mr. Kenyatta, they wanted the US, they wanted the European Union. And I look back, if you look at Rwanda in 1990, it was the West which tried to mediate. The Western embassies were involved in Kigali, and the government didn't control the process. They lost control of the country. There was an invasion by a force financed by the West largely. What happened? whatever you want to call it, Rwandan genocide or massive killings, it was a failure. The government had no sovereignty. In Burundi in 2015 and 2016, there was a Western-supported group based on the Tutsi minority. And by the way, not all Tutsis supported it, by the way, very much not so. And at that time, 9 years ago, the African Union was not as clear in their thinking as they are now. And they said, well, we're going to send a force into Burundi, which is a small country, 10 million people, 8 million people, to mediate. Burundi said, no, if you enter us, we're going to fight you. The African Union a month later backed off and said, we're not going to send an intervening force. Burundi remained sovereign and did not have a massive war. So your country, and I'm sure that the thinkers in your country understand this, it's very important not to delegate responsibility to outside the scope of responsible forces. And you have now a mediator from Nigeria who seems to be playing a proper role. And you have the African Union, which in many ways is standing up for Africa. And it's a very dangerous situation in your country. It's a very sad situation that people are being killed. You have a government which is elected overwhelmingly in June 2021. And it's up to your government, with the help of the African Union, to resolve this. And it's not an international struggle, it's a national issue and not an international issue. That's my view. And well, I think this is something which has to be discussed among intellectuals in the world and political persons. And of course, it's up to your country to resolve it.
Wow. Beautifully put there, Mr. Philpot. This is my final question. Many countries have played down these reports as biased, politically motivated, and incoherent. And this is said to bear witness to the challenges, being posed by this dictatorial, unipolar world, as many say. So in your view, to what extent is this true? Does this make sense at all?
Yes, it makes sense a lot. And the era of Western intervention and imposing human rights to further a political goal is coming to an end. I don't know how fast it's going to disappear. It's been like, say, 500 years, where the West has controlled everything. And I'm a white man from the West, but I traveled to India a 3 or 4 years ago. And the phenomenal culture of India before 1600, the West was backward and India was ahead. China was way ahead 500 years ago. So I think we're looking at a change in the world, which we should welcome. And the unipolar world appears to be coming to an end. If you look at the war in Ukraine, which is a litmus test of in the present world, the only 15% of the world supports sanctions, Western sanctions on Russia. The rest of the world is not supporting these sanctions. There's a map of the countries which support sanctions, and then the UN had a vote on Nazism and racism, and the countries who voted for and against and abstained. The countries voted against and who abstained are the same countries which are imposing sanctions on Russia. So a picture speaks better than 1,000 words. I don't have the picture for us, right? But Mr. Zelensky, and like I'm from Canada, we had Ukrainians come here in 1948, 49, 50. they are right-wing, conservative, racist. We want to be non-racist. And Mr. Zelensky, even though he's Jewish, the country is Nazi-oriented, all right? And when Mr. Zelensky spoke, he speaks to schools in Canada, he speaks to Parliament in Britain, he speaks to the US House of Representatives by Zoom. But when he spoke to Africa, 4 countries attended, I think in May. I have the date, but he wanted to speak to African countries. They didn't attend, and Macky Sall attended because he was president of the African Union, but we know that he is friendly to Russia. So there's 3 countries. I don't remember which names they are. So in this case, I can say something. Well, anyway, I was at a meeting in Malawi in August, and a very important person who I respect a lot said, Africa got it right this time by being independent. And I think that's a very positive thing. The unipolar world is probably it's dying, and it's coming to an end. The rate at which it comes to an end is something which, of course, is beyond the scope of my capacity or yours to measure it.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your ideas and for your time, to talk about such important issue.
Well, your country's in the leadership with others on this, and we're sitting here hoping and trying to support you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And dear viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you as well for having been with us. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me.